In this video, we're going to be making a tech house song inspired by BISCITS Beatport Top 10 Freak. And we're going to find out if we can do this in under 6 hours by using the 80-20 rule of music production. What you're listening to is the finished song we'll be breaking down today. And I'm going to show you how this Ableton project file was made, layer by layer, in the original order I followed, so you can easily follow along yourself. This tune only took me about 6 hours to finish, completely arranged, mixed, mastered, and ready to be used in DJ sets and sent out to record labels. After having produced music for over 15 years, this is easily the fastest and best way I've come across. You can download this video's project files, as well as over 30 full project files inspired by Beatport Top 100 songs, with new files being added weekly. Just visit the link on screen or in the description. And if finishing songs super fast like this is something you'd like help with, you can also download a free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that I use to completely finish one song per week. The thing is, most artists make finishing songs harder than it needs to be because they lose motivation and direction along the way. But the good news is, there's a simple way to start new songs with confidence, knowing you'll stay motivated and focused from start to finish. Before you even start producing, choose a reference track and a main hook. Use your reference track so that your layers, structure, and mixing are inspired by a professional example, and use a main hook from the beginning to push you to make production decisions in service of that main hook and to prevent you from straight up copying your reference. For each one of my projects, I like to make a project file page like this as a guide to help clearly explain this reference and remix concept, as well as all the other aspects that go into my specific production workflow. So for this project, the reference track that we were using is BISCITS Tune Freak. And what I'll do is look up a little bit of music theory stuff here. So we have the key is in B minor and the BPM is in 128 BPM. Then what I'll do is find the remix track, the hook that I want to use over top of it, and listening to them over top of each other a little bit to kind of hear some kind of similarities and see if I can kind of get a little spark going. A big part of that will also be then having a look at the theory of the hook. So in this instance, this remix here is in the key of G minor and the BPM of 123 BPM. So starting with the similarities between the BPM, you can see it's 123 versus 128. This means that we can pitch this up without turning the vocalist into too much of a chipmunk. And in terms of the key of the two tunes, if we open up this little handy music theory cheat sheet that I have, we have the remixes in G minor and the references is in B minor. So the difference is 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones. So it's not too much. It's a little bit too high, I would say, of a pitch to turn her into a chipmunk for going too many semitones. So what we could do though is you can see there's a pretty easy way that we can move up the pitch a little of the vocal and then move down the reference a little bit to have them kind of meet in the middle. So that way everything is going to sound nicely. And so the remix track that I went with is this really sick tune by Kaisa, I think you say, called Hideaway. I'm actually pretty sure she's a Canadian artist, which is really cool. And it really grabs that like old school housey kind of vibe. Which works really nicely because this BISCITS tune has this kind of diva-ish vocal that comes in at a certain point. And so I was trying to find a similarity to match that when producing the tune. So the closer that you can get the remix track to sound like an element in the reference, the better of a time that you're going to have. Yeah, so it's a super sick tune. There's also some really interesting, there's a really cool housey, like analog bass. So I kind of ended up wanting to use a little bit of that, but a really big key here, especially if you're doing the remix thing, is to try to just take the vocal. This way you can just easily take away the vocal and you have your own built out track to the reference that you can use as an original. You can put your own original vocal in there later. You can get somebody to do a cover version, and it makes it a lot easier to actually release something at the end of the day. But ultimately, the key takeaway here is to take at least 10 or 15 minutes thinking through the vision for your song so you can end up with a high quality production, get fired up about the song you're about to work on, and greatly reduce the chances that you're going to be spending like days or weeks working on something like this just to find out it was never a good idea to begin with. So having just some kind of comparisons, listening to the key, making sure everything kind of matches nicely is going to save you a lot of like headaches down the line. But the thing that really matters the most really is to get into Ableton, jump into our DAW, and actually start testing these ideas. So let's jump into Ableton right now to show you what following a system like this allows me to finish in just the first hour of starting a new song, because this process here takes about maybe 20 or 30 minutes for me to find the reference and remix. All right, so this is a look at the Ableton project file for this one, and one of the first things I'll do is set up two particular tracks. First is I'll drop in the reference track into an area in my DAW here, one of the tracks here. And then I will use what's called an arrangement or structure track, which is just a bunch of empty MIDI clips that I'll color code and label to figure out the sections, like the main sections of the song. So we have like the classic intro and outro, where the sub kicks in, a couple different breaks, the different drops. And this comes in handy for a couple of reasons. One is when we're building out the loop, we're able to jump between the song quickly to like find out if, say, we're working on the sub, we can jump over here. If we're working on the main drop and we want to figure out the main hook, how that's going to all work, we can easily navigate the song. And it's going to make it super easy too when we first build out vertically the loop. When we build out horizontally, when we stretch out this loop into a finished song, it's going to make it a lot easier because we can use this as a guide. So that's definitely the first step. And then something I've also been doing a little bit more lately too is using the locators in Ableton to just highlight some of the different parts of layers that are coming in and out of the tune. Because one of the big things is to overproduce the loop in this stage so that we basically have a lot more layers to work with when we are arranging. Something that you might, like, that's happened to me before is build out the layers from, say, this drop section and then not realize that there's actually some extra little synths and stuff like that that come in and out. And so then you don't produce those, and then when you're arranging, you kind of get stuck and have to add more parts in later. The idea is to try to get that all out of the way at the beginning. So that's kind of the idea here, and we'll just set up the reference so I can flick back and forth between it just by pressing the S key. You can map it to anything you want, but the idea is to solo the reference and then listen to what we're playing, and so we can build out by flicking back and forth the reference and what we're building out. For a closer look at how to do that on the project file pages, if we scroll down to here, this section here will show you how to set up these, this video here will show you how to reference and arrange, how to set up those two tracks correctly. How to use reference tracks correctly is the name of the video. And all these videos are also in a YouTube playlist that's in the description as well, called the 80/20 Music Production Course, if you want to just stay here on YouTube. But with that said, that's kind of the first step. And then once that's looking good, what I will then do is use AI stem splitting software to do a couple of things. First, I will also get like the remix hook in the project file here. So we have the Kaisa Hideaway track in here, and then I'll use that to separate out the vocals. So I want that in there first because, like I said, it's nice to have the reference and the remix both in here while you're building things out, so that you're building to the reference, but then also listening to the hook that you're going to be moving towards to have that influence your decision. So you're moving into more of an original territory and not fully carbon copying the reference. So what that ended up sounding like is this. So that's that one part of the hook, and then I think there's like a couple different verses that sound like this. So sick. Another part over here. The one I was using was called Nuo stems. It's like $30 for all you can eat stem separation, so I think that's pretty good. In terms of any processing, I used an auto shift this time to pitch it down one semitone, removing some of the low end, and then a little compressor to kind of keep the dynamics kind of tighter, and then using this standard little channel strip that I have on most of my tracks. It's like the default thing that I go over in this video here. All the project file pages have this VST guide that you can check out, and there's also a video for it in the YouTube description. Basically, in this instance, just some sidechain, some pumping, so that it's kind of making room for the kick, and adding kind of like that dancey vibe. So having the hook in there is super important. And then what I'll do is, this is kind of an interesting thing that I've been doing a lot more lately, is what I'll do is I'll stem separate out the section of the reference track. And the main reason is I want to have some drums set up. So I'll show you why and what that sounds like. So let's just turn everything off for now. And I separate out like a little 8-bar or so, 16-bar section of the tune. And then have the drums on their own. So it sounds like this. Let me actually. And so this is useful to have everything separated out. So as you're kind of referencing the track, you can also like slice pieces of the stem separated drums, or even like the melodic bits, to then use Ableton's similar sound functionality to find similar sounds in your library, or if you want to straight up sample it. It's super useful. But one of the things I've been doing first is validating the idea in this as part of this first step. And so the idea that I'll do is first grab like a nice slice of the kick drum and get the kick drum working first. So what I've built out first is the kick. So if we have a listen to this. And whenever doing this kind of referencing, the way that I like to do is I follow 3 steps. First is figure out the pattern. Second is figure out the sound. And then third is set up the volume. And that's going to kind of get you that 80-20 result a lot quicker. The lowest amount of effort for the highest amount of results, basically. So just looking back and forth between the reference, and it got me this kick pattern, which is just the classic 4 on the floor. Boom, 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 boom. And then in terms of the sound, what I did was I sliced out a bit, like a 1 kick out from the stem separated drum section here. And then I've been using this really sick plugin called Drum Clone. And so basically you can drop that into here. And what it sounded like at first was this. So you can hear there's like a bunch of crunchiness, maybe like hi-hats or like something percussion in that high end, and like a little extra like bit of tails coming in here. And then when it's processed through this, it sounds like this. So pretty sick. Like it does a pretty nice job of taking that out, and now you don't have like a stolen piece of the kick there. And then I'm finding with this, what I'll do is then let me show you actually exactly how this looks. You can drag the final sample that it has out. I don't know what I just did there, but and then I just drag it into another like area in the drum rack. This way I have it just like the audio. And because one of the main things is sometimes I feel like you need to transpose the end result like down, usually a semitone, from that drum clone process. It just seems to be something that tends to happen. Just like a little tip if you end up using that. But in this case, I didn't have to do that. And then in terms of any other processing, there's nothing really going on here. Something I've been doing is adding in this little bit of snapback. So there's like a little bit of this club transient. So it's just adding a little bit of like weight to the low end. Nothing too crazy there. The EQ here, I usually just have this mostly so I can flick this off and on as an arrangement trick to cut the low end out of the kick. But that's pretty much it for that. The main thing then is flicking back and forth between that kick and the reference to get the volume similar. So it's get the pattern correct, get the sound selection as similar as you can to that result, and then get the volume, and then you're really in the ballpark there. So then the next thing that I've been doing as part of this step is then going over to the reference, like the reference isolated drums, and then adding in that EQ here to just remove all the low end, around 200 hertz or so. This way we're effectively removing the kick drum from that track, and that way we can do something like this. So I'm going to play these two together. Let me turn on the group. And so now what we have here is all like the kind of snares and hats and everything from the referenced sampled bit here, and we have our own kick. And the reason I like to do this is now we can move on to say the bass and the other melodic parts of the loop. And I find this super important because that's usually, at least personally, where I get hung up. When you're starting to add all the melodic bits and trying to make it fit with the hook, you might find that you run into a situation where the melodic stuff isn't working correctly with the hook, and the whole idea might not actually work. And so normally, like what I would do, like way back in like a couple months ago, is build out all the drums for the drum loops, because I find that super easy to do and fast. But then the problem is you could spend a bunch of time building up the drums, then move on to the melodic stuff, and then find out that the melodic stuff isn't actually working, and you need to scrap the whole idea. So this is all just in an effort to like validate the idea faster. So what I like to do is just use the isolated drums from the reference as like a top loop, Get the kick going, because the kick and bass relationship is super important. That's what we're going to focus on next. And this way we can use that to kind of catch the vibe and move on to the melodic stuff, make sure the melodic stuff is working good, and then come back and redo all the layers and make our own original drum parts referencing the reference track there. So once I have this going, so it's basically like a drum loop with our own kick in there, the next thing I'll move on to is dialing in the bass. And so for the bass, let's have a look and listen to that. This is what I ended up with. So this is this cool, like super lowish kind of subby rolling bass kind of idea. In terms of the pattern, I believe what I did for this is when you separate out the drums, you can usually get like the bass, as you can see here. And so I just dragged the bass into the empty MIDI clip, and it did that audio to MIDI bit, and it's usually not perfect, so you'll have to adjust it. But the main thing is to flick back and forth between the reference track and what you have to kind of just use your ear to match a similar pattern. What I ended up with was this. And then in terms of the sound, there's a particular way I like to go about this. Usually I have this little bass group system, and for a more detailed look in this, you're going to want to check out this video here, the best bass grouping system for massive low end. This will go over what I'm about to show you in more detail, and it's also in that YouTube playlist as well. But the idea is to first start with the sub. And the main reason is that it's like a pure bass sound, and you can really just focus on getting the notes correct. So with just the sub, it sounds like this. And it really is like the majority of the bass sound, like truly. And then the idea is then we can use these additional layers to add in mid bass sounds to then add that extra character, have it punch out of like speakers a little bit more, and add like that interest to that bass sound. And so in terms of the actual sound of the sub, I'm just using this. Basically, it's something I created called the V sub. If you want access to it, you can grab it in the project files. It's just an operator basically doing a sine wave. It's a super pure, really carries the nice weight of the low end. And then I'm adding in for variations of saturation or drive or distortion to kind of add the way I've been describing it is it fills in the gap between the sub, the super low end, and then that mid bass, so that there's like it blends it in nicely with the mid bass. So what we have is that's basically going there. Built into it is also a side chain right here, and so this is part of that channel strip. But it's basically just Ableton's shaper device, then mapped to quarter notes, then mapped to a gain. This way, it's a one knob sidechain, as long as you're like doing 4 on the floor, like house music, dance music. You don't necessarily need to do all that kind of compressing, routing, all that kind of crazy stuff that I feel like takes up time and pisses me off. Just trying to move quickly is the main thing here. And then the idea, actually work is on. Let's go for it. Then I have these additional bass layers. So if I play this by itself, sounds like crap by itself, right? But it's just adding in some of that mid bass layer. And what I've basically done as part of that bass grouping trick is you'll notice there's no MIDI here. The MIDI is coming in from the sub layer. So that way this MIDI is automatically routed to these areas. And then you can use a pitch device here. As you can see, just with one click, I can go up or down different octaves to make sure that we don't have to adjust the notes. And if we work on the tune and find out that like the bass line isn't what we want, like way into the process, changing it on this layer, we don't have to like copy and paste it over 1,000 times. And then this next layer added in was this, which sounds like this. It's kind of weird little sound. And basically what I did for this sound is I use this thing called Synplant, and with we're not going to update it yet. What I did is I extracted out the bass as well. So we had the isolated bass, and I grabbed a slice of that, dropped it into Synplant, and then Synplant can use like AI machine learning stuff to come up with variations to try to replicate that sound with the synthesizer here. And you can hear here, it's mostly trying to pick up like that like mid bass kind of character of the sound, because the weight of everything's coming from the sub, and then we're just adding in these subtle additional layers to kind of add that mid bass character and vibe to things, and then ultimately ends up sounding like this. And without those layers, So you can hear it's like really subtle stuff, and really like the majority, at least a lot for this like techie stuff, this low end stuff, it's subs. It's mostly just like sub sounds for a decent amount of the tracks. At least in this example, this is what we arrived at. So at this point, what I would do and what I did in this process is I would jump over to like a section like this. So like we were using the reference track to really copy the bass sound. What I would do at this point is reintroduce the hook and then adjust the bass so that like the notes that the bass are playing so that it's working properly with the hook. So I did end up, I think, changing the key of the tunes. I think originally it was pedaling on like a B note. The note that we ended up with for this remix version, it's pedaling on an F sharp. And so then what I'll do is like listen to the vocal with the bass layer so that it sounds something like this. Oh, and then let me in this section I don't have the drums. I really want to show you exactly like kind of what each section was sounding like as I was working on it. So yeah, so I would add in the vocals and then adjust the bass so that it's working with the drums and our new hook. So I don't know about you, but for me, like as I was building this out, I was like, okay, that sounds fucking sick. Like this is gonna be awesome. And so that kind of gives the confidence to like, okay, let's keep working on this tune. Let's spend the time to like actually finish it. So then the next phase would be for me, I think actually at this point, that would kind of end phase, like the first step of this process for me. Once I have like the kick and the sub and the vocal and like a little drum loop that we'll end up replacing working well, like that's really the majority of the tune. And that really gives like a good sign that like the vision is there. This is sounding sick. Let's double down on this and spend the time on this track. Or this could be a good point where it's like, okay, this sucks and let's move on to a different idea. So this first step, like picking the reference track, picking the remix track, dropping everything into here, setting things up with the arrangement track and the reference track, and then building up these first few layers. This step will usually take me about an hour, and I usually like to do this on Fridays. And really the big lesson here is to test out your song's vision with as little time and effort as possible at this beginning stage with as little amount of time and energy and effort as possible, so that you aren't wasting your time later on developing an idea that might never actually work. But none of this will actually matter unless we finish the loop that we started, and we can do this in a very special way that puts us in a position where we're structuring and arranging our song later. That ends up being the easiest and fastest part of the process. So kind of carrying on from like what I was mentioning before, what I like to do at this stage is continue with the melodic stuff. Personally, for me, I find that, again, like this can be something that you adjust for your own way that you kind of go about this. I like to continue on with the melodic bits because we do have this drum loop that's sounding awesome and like we can use to really carry the vibe. And continue on. And melodic stuff is for me where things can get messed up. Like you can like kind of do things in the wrong key and things start not sounding great and all that. So I like to move on with the melodic elements. And the main thing here is to make sure that like you have your vocals on the entire time because you want to build everything in service of that main hook. I think that's a super important thing. That's also why I like having that hook figured out from the beginning, whether it's a remix or not. This way you're doing everything in service of that hook, so it's always there are elements being added to add more shine to that and not take it away. For the interest of this tutorial, I'm going to turn it off so there's not like vocals over like me talking kind of thing. I hope you can understand that. Yeah, so what I'll do next is it's that similar process I was talking about earlier, where we're going to be the idea is to flick back and forth between what we're working on and the reference and like picking out sounds and like replicating them. You can do it as accurately as you'd like, or you can kind of do it to catch the vibe. This is where I would say like your natural like creativity should come through, because I think you should be kind of replicating the reference as a way to be learning, and it is super useful. But if you can add your own creativity throughout it and use it more as inspiration rather than carbon copying, then you end up with something you could actually release, which is super cool. So the first element that I added was this small little stab kind of sound. So let me kind of show you the MIDI and we'll play through it right now. And soloed, it sounds like this. So it's almost this like little like stab, tom, low end kind of thing. Really subtle stuff, but that's what I heard first and decided to work with. In terms of the pattern, it's just playing this little A note on the like kind of just before each bar. And what I did is I set it up so that the first hit is by itself, and then the second one plays an octave lower. So it's just kind of a little bit of a variation going on. In terms of the sound design, what I did here is I sliced a piece from the AI separated like synth part that it had, and then used Ableton's similar sound function. So I do talk about that in detail in this video here, the better system to steal kick samples from pro artists. So this is a good way to extract the drum sounds, and we'll get into that more later as well. But basically, this will show you how to use Ableton's similar sound functionality, where you can basically right-click on any sound, and then it'll show similar sounds that you have in your library. And so in this instance, I was able to find this little one-shot clean wub sound from my library, dropped it in here, and then converted it to a sampler. So as you can see right now, it's a sampler, and you can convert it to simpler. You can right-click and do the opposite. So you'll start off as a simpler, you can turn it into a sampler. And the main reason is because sometimes with these things, you want to change the root note. So you can see here that this sound is playing, it's starting off on an F. And so if we change it so that the root acknowledges that the sample root key is an F, then the notes that we play here it'll like move it basically so that like a C is actually a C and that kind of thing, as opposed to pitching it relatively. Hopefully that makes sense. And then in terms of any processing, this is like the standard channel strip stuff that I do. So this will be on most tracks, will show up automatically. And I have it set up to automatically remove everything under 200 hertz. This is a good starting point for me to either add in a little bit more of the low end or take away more of the low end. And generally I like to keep this area nice and clean. It's going to make things less muddy, and leave that area open for like the kick and the sub to be really dominating that area. Then we have the standard channel strip. I'll explain each thing as they're necessary, but in this instance, all I'm doing is adding in a bit of that side chain, so it's pumping and making room for the kick. And this is a one knob thing. It's actually set up to automatically have a small amount of that side chain automatically happening, where it's not too much, and I can dial it up or down. And so that way it's just all about moving really quickly throughout the process. And then the main thing though, you can see actually all this processing, I actually didn't even make any moves. The main thing would be flicking back and forth to the reference, dialing your ear into that element that you've added in, and getting the volume correct. The volume is going to be like really the biggest thing here. So the next element that I added in was this kind of like stab I was hearing at the beginning of the sound, which sounds like this. And I'm going to solo it next. Sorry, I'm going to solo it next. And then the pattern looks like this. It's same like notes as the little small stab. It's just happening at the beginning. It's playing a little bit longer. And in this instance, it's actually playing the exact same sample as that small stab. It's just processed a little differently in terms of what I've done is with the sampler, I've set it up so it has these like loop points. So the sound like plays and then reverses back on itself. And so it like extends the sound a little bit more. And then the main thing is that you can probably hear there's just more. The two things really that really the only thing that are really changing is that I've dialed back the EQ so that instead of it cutting off at 200, it's cutting off at 116. So there's just more low end coming through. And then same amount of sidechain, and I'm also using this with plugins. So this is a free plugin from Polyverse called Polyverse Wider. And basically the idea that I like to do for a lot of this stuff, and all this stuff you can grab in like the project files, and I have individual tools that you can download, like just these on their own. This pushes the sound to the left and right, makes it more stereo. And the idea is that instead of always having to open up like that plugin every time, you can just dial it in with one knob and map it to the one knob, so you're not opening it up, figuring out how to use the weird interface and all that kind of stuff. It's just there for you. When you have it dialed all the way to the left, it automatically turns off the VST, so it's not impacting the sound in any way, and it's not adding any CPU load. Just like little things like that just make things super quick. So it's just like, oh, I want width, dial it in with one button. That's the idea there. But the main thing is the volume. You can see it's dialed in a bit more compared to the small stab. Next element that I added in was this little vocoder rhythm kind of thing. So let's have a look and listen to that. And solo it. So it's pretty subtle stuff. It's like it's kind of very percussive is the kind of the sound that I was hearing in the tune, and like I feel like it slowly opens up throughout the track. And so what I did here is I found a cool like bongo loop, and I dropped that in here. Then I threw a vocoder on here, set it to external, and have it so that the subs, so like the notes that the bass is playing, is what's impacting the vocoder. So like those bass notes are coming through on these percussion hits, played a little bit with like kind of like the whatever this thing is, like the frequencies it hits. So that way, like it's almost like the bass notes and sound is coming through on the percussion bits. It's a cool little like minimal tech thing that they do. And then what I did is I added in this neat device called Tantra, which is like adds like cool kind of glitchy sounds. And you can see that I've just mapped the mix so that it's automating a little bit throughout the track. So it's like opening up that like Tantra weird kind of glitchy sound throughout the track and then closing it and shutting it. What I also do, by the way, is any of these like third-party plugins like this that are paid plugins, I freeze these in the project file so you don't like it won't mess up for you or anything. And then we're just removing some of the lows. And then a little bit of side chain, so it's pumping, a little bit of width, pushing to the left and right. And then we are using the sustain here. So what this is the free kilohertz transient shaper. And what we can do here is it can detect the transients. So we could use it to soften the initial attack, or the sustain, the tail of it. We can tighten it up with one knob here, which is super cool. I feel like tighter sounds sound a lot cleaner and nicer. And then main thing is just flicking back and forth, trying to dial in that sound in terms of the volume. And then let's hear what we have next. I think these actually come in a little bit further. Okay, I'm gonna just rip through some of these extra ones because some of this stuff, there's this like interesting marimba kind of sound I think that you can hear in the tune, or at least it sounds like a blend between like a chord stab and like a percussive hit. So I'm gonna jump to a section where you can hear it a little bit cleaner, which I think is here. Doing this kind of like rhythm. In terms of the MIDI, it looks like this. It's just repeating. Do, 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 do. I kind of combined a couple different techniques because ultimately what I'm kind of adding for that is these two sounds together. And so I have one pan to the left, one pan to the right. The one on the left, I'm using Synplant. So again, what I did is I found like a section where that sound was playing, and then use the AI snippet of it to slice that out and drop it in here to get kind of a synthesized version. And then I also right-clicked it and did the similar sound functionality to get this like, find this sample in my library that does something similar. Sample. Synthesize thing. So you can hear it's cool to have like, it's cool to see the two different versions of machine learning, whether it's looking through a sample or like synthesizing it. They come similar, and then but they're also kind of unique and different, and that's why I kind of went for that idea of panning one to left, panning one to the right. Kind of standard channel strip stuff here, nothing too crazy. And then the next thing I was adding in was that like, I think this is a little bit more I was talking about with that marimba kind of sound. So let me play this all together. And so here's the individual layers. I have again did Synplant for one, and then found like an interesting. I found that there's a couple different cool variations of it. So what I did is I had one pan to the left, which sounds like this. It's a weird sound, just kind of like percussive take on it that I end up with. And then this next one on the right. Still kind of percussive-y, almost lasery, and then the similar sound function got me this part that I think carries the majority of the sound. And then altogether, this was just an effort to try to kind of get that melodic yet percussive sound of it. But yeah, it's a smaller element that comes in and out of the tune. I think it's a lot more interesting in the main one, but I kind of started moving towards focusing on the hook of the remix, because the remix of that, like that Kaiser tune is so freaking cool. So I went down that area, and then the next thing adding in is this little like kind of like acidy sound. And so there's this cool like repeating pattern that they have like that. I think their sounded like the BISCITS tune. I think it sounded more like marimba, like percussive yet melodic kind of sound again for this. I kind of ended up with this acid sound for some reason, and I thought it ended up sounding so freaking cool that I ended up like kind of taking in a different direction, going for the acid sound. But yeah, I think that's kind of a good look at that, of the melodic stuff before moving on. Then there's a couple of extra things I added. I used Scalar, which is like this, like helps you figure out chords of things. I used Scalar to figure out the chords of the tune. And this is something I've been starting to do lately. You can actually, like, I looked up the Kaiser tune. If you're doing a remix, you can just look up the chord progression on Google, which helps a lot. And I'm finding just having the chord progression in here, even if you're not going to use it, can come in handy as you're building up the tune, so you don't get confused of like what chords to play and that kind of thing. And I end up using it a lot in like the breakdown of this tune. And I end up liking the sound of like the scalar piano, so I left that in. And then there's this thing I love called Crystallizer, especially with the crystals presets. It adds that like granular echo kind of sound. Very subtle and light, but something really cool there. So then with that said, the next thing, I think if you can hear it from here, there's a string sound that comes in at certain points. And I think it was mostly in the breakdowns of the BISCITS tune. But the idea here is, I guess really quick explaining the sound, it's one note playing, like the house string idea is one note that's just sustaining. And then what I've done is I created my own little thing, like a little device where I found like a nice house string sample and then set it up so it has loop points. So it'll like loop between the left and right here. So it can like infinitely play that note if you'd like it to. Add a little crystallizer, a little bit of like the standard channel shift stuff, but I don't want to get too into the weeds on that, because the main thing here is, as you can see, like some of these parts are not playing throughout the entire tune. But the idea at this point, when you're in this like step 2 is what I'm calling this, is to overproduce the loop. So we have as many elements as possible, so that when we're doing the arrangement, we have more puzzle pieces to work with. And that's why I like having these like little new like markers where it's like, okay, if you just listen to like the section of the song here, there's maybe no string, and some of these elements aren't actually in it. But if you listen to the whole arrangement, some of these things come in and out. So at this phase, overproducing the loop, giving yourself as many layers to work with is really, really important. I feel like it's going to make things a lot easier when we move into the next step, which we're about to do shortly. So the next thing is, once I have the melodic bits set up, the next thing is I'll actually go through the process of replacing that AI kind of top loop that we had with our own elements. And it's the same process of flicking back and forth between the reference and what we're working on, going element to element to element, following that same process of pattern, sound selection, and volume. So let me walk you through how that worked out in this instance. So I'm just going to turn off all the drums, and we're just going to kind of start building out the layers here. And so what I'll usually do is kind of like listen to the elements that I think are having the largest impact, and like wherever my ear is hearing, like produce that first, because it must be, to me, what's the most important thing. So first thing I added, oddly enough, was a little different for me, is adding in this Congo loop. So let's have a look and listen to that. And then soloed. And so for this, I just grabbed a slice of like the Congo that was playing in that AI separated drum loop, and then used a similar sound function to build a little library of a couple different conga hits that I was liking. And that gave a little bit of variation, so I can flick back and forth to figure out the pattern, and then have like different hits hitting at different times to kind of try to go for a kind of humanization kind of an effect. In terms of any processing, we're just removing the lows, a little bit of sidechain, nothing too crazy, just standard stuff there. Main thing was dialing in the volume. Next element that I heard hitting it the hardest was the open hi-hat. So let's have a look and listen to that. And so for this part, the pattern is that classic, like every other beat, like the offbeat kind of thing. So one thing I'll do is, in my templates, I'll set it up so that like this open hat here already has like that pattern playing. This way it's just a matter of like grabbing it and moving the sound up and down, or duplicating it to add in extra layers. And so I started off with, let's have a look. I think for this one, there's quite a few layers that I ended up adding here. One of the first things I did was I sliced out the part of the referenced AI separated drums where just the open hat was playing. And it sounded a little like this. And I added that in as a bit of a layer, and then I also used that similar sound function. So I think I can kind of show you what it looks like. Yeah, you can do like next similar, previous similar, save a similarity reference, return to reference. You can maybe even do it from here. Yeah, show similar files is usually what I do, and it'll show it up on the left here. And that made me find a couple different layers. So it maybe found this. So they're all not perfect. That's why I ended up grabbing a couple different ones and then added them all together and kind of layered them into taste is really how I did. And I had one like maybe panned a little bit more to the left. Do I have any panned to the right? Probably some down the center. This one's a little bit to the left as well. And then that was kind of how I went about finding the sound. It was mostly slicing it, actually taking the slice, and then also using the similar sound functionality to find some additional hits that are reinforcing the sliced open hat sound there. And altogether, that's what that sounds like. In terms of the processing, we're just running into the standard channel strip stuff. So we're moving a bunch of the lows. And then something that is really cool, I turned off the sidechain on this one, no width. The sustain is something that if you look here, and I really want to show this is actually really sick, is you can use the sustain of like in like a transient shaper to, like you can hear the open hat here, and then the open hat here. You can hear that it's more open and more closed, so maybe even more like intense example would be here. And then listen to it here. So that's actually the same hi-hat. You can use the transient shaper, the sustain here, to tighten up the sound so it's almost more like a closed hat. And it's a way you can, as like an arrangement trick, change the energy over the course of the tune. So over here in this like intro, it's really tight. And then as like the first 8 bars of the first kind of subsection comes in, it's opened up more. And then in the second half of it, it opens up even more as a way to kind of change the energy throughout the tune. So nice little trick there for sure. And then again, main thing is flicking back and forth, trying to get the volume of that open hat correct. Next element I added in was the closed hi-hat. So let's take a look and listen to that. Let's solo it. So it's a pretty subtle layer. When it comes to closed hats, what I like to do is first start off with this here to keep things simple. So this is a closed hat playing on that offbeat, just like the open hat. And I'll usually start with this as a way to reinforce the open hat. It helps the open hat like punch through a bit as like a thickness to it almost. It's a subtle layer, but it also comes in handy where if you were to like remove, as an arrangement trick, remove the open hat, and then have the open hat come in on like the second half of it, you still have that driving kind of sound in place. So it's not too empty. And then the next thing that I'll add in is like listen for like the shuffly extra bit. So just looking back and forth between this and the reference, kind of heard this little extra little shuffliness. Is kind of what I was hearing. And the idea that I'll usually do is like maybe start with 1 or 2 of the notes, and then if you look at it, like work at it in sections. So the first time it's like this, and the second time it's just changing the positions that are playing. So that way, kind of just get like the pattern down once, and then you can create variations by having the different hats playing throughout each section to section. It's just a way to like humanize things and make it sound a little bit more interesting and evolving over time. Have it just playing different hats. In terms of the hi-hat sounds, this is something I like to do to save time with the closed hats. I went through the process of finding my favorite hat sounds, and then just adding it to this little drum rack here, and having this closed hat track always in my template, so it's there for me, and that way I can just go to these sounds that I've already liked, and I don't have to go through the process of going through like hundreds of closed hat sounds. It's just an effort to speed things up, and also makes it so like there's similar sounds between my songs to my songs. And then in terms of any processing, we're dialing back the attack a little bit, so it's that transient's not hitting as hard, so it's like kind of like nestling in a little bit more, because it is kind of a subtle layer. And then dialing into sustain, so it's tightening up that sound a little bit. and then a little bit of just like removing some of the lows. The next element that I added in was this snare that I heard that was pretty important, so let's take a look and listen to that. This is a pretty important element of the tune. I'm just going to solo it real quick. And so for this, the pattern is on the 2, 4, 2, and 4. This, again, is a classic position for this kind of, for snares and claps. So again, I have my template set up, so there's already some MIDI set up on those. So it's just a matter of like flicking through the sounds. In terms of the sounds, what I did was, again, I found a little slice of the drum loop. So again, I guess also put it into perspective a little. If you look here, something I like to do is like I've sliced out each bit and I'll try to color it so I can figure out clearly where those slices are. So that's what I did for the snare here. Found a section of the snare where it was by itself. And I think what I did do, I'm not sure if this is the element. Hopefully I can show this nicely. Let's hear what this is. Okay, that was something else. But sometimes what you might need to do to make the similar sound function a little bit more reliable is like splice out the snare, drag that snare onto a different audio track, and then with that audio track, have an EQ on it that's removing the low end. So you're trying to get the kick out of that snare sample, and then flatten and freeze it by just right-clicking and pressing freeze and flatten. And then you'll have a snare sample that has a kick somewhat removed. And that way, when you right-click it, like this, and do the show similar files little trick, Ableton's gonna more try to find snares because the kick isn't in there as much. So you're just trying to have that functionality do have that functionality do a better job by isolating out the sound more before engaging the AI overlord power kind of thing. With that said, in terms of this, then this, what I did then was find 2 different snare sounds from that process, and then I layered those over top of each other, and then a little bit of the sustain. We're tightening the sustain, so it's a tighter snare sound. I find like tighter sounds, particularly in the drums, just sounds a little bit more professional. And sometimes the samples in your library, they'll have more like reverb, and just like the sound's a bit like fatter than it needs to be, because I want it to sound cool when you're just clicking by itself. But like in a overall drum sound, tighter I think works a lot nicer. So just removing some of the sustain there, and then we are dialing out some of the low end, and then just a little bit of a high shelf to take away, a subtle way to take out some of the high end. Because when you do it with like this, the filter, the hard filter like that, it can sound a little bit more obvious and like not transparent. When you use the shelf to just bring down the high end a little bit, it's subtle. It just does it a little bit. And I just wanted the snare to be not hit as hard in the high end, and to kind of nestle itself in a little bit more is the mindset there. Then something I personally like to always do is like layer in claps. So the idea is to have like the snare more or less down the middle, and then I like having claps a little bit more stereo. It's a personal thing. I do hear it in a lot of tunes, but what I ended up here is, in terms of the pattern, we have it on the 2, 4, 2, and 4. And what I personally like to do is usually have a couple of different clap sounds. Sometimes I'll pan them left and right, but the idea is like clap sound, and then having like slight different variations. So it's kind of like building up the energy, then bringing it back down at the beginning of this little loop. Again, it's like humanization stuff, keeping the subtle ways to keep things interesting, particularly in house music, having the sounds evolve a little bit and not be too machine drum, like, you know what I mean, like robotic, and just the exact same loop to loop. Kind of keeps things like more interesting when you change up the sounds a little bit. In terms of, let's see if I did any panning. Yeah, I have one panned a bit to the right and one panned a bit to the left. Then on top of that, using a bit of that wider width one plugin to kind of push it even more to the left and right, keeping the space in the middle free for that snare to come through even more. And then a little bit of a bunch of the low end being taken away on the claps here. And then again, main thing, flicking back and forth, trying to match what you hear in the reference. Also something you might do when you're layering in, say if you have a snare first and then you're layering in the clap, what you can do is have the clap all the way down like this, and then slowly build it in, and kind of, as you start to hear it, maybe use your own ear and dial it into taste when you're adding in layers like this that might not be obviously in the reference track. Then almost at the end of this section of building up the loop, and then we'll get into the arrangement, which is again super fast. The idea that I usually go for is to build up the core drum loop with our own MIDI. So we have our own MIDI playing and our own one-shots playing, and that's really the core of the sound. And then reinforce that with like drum breaks or top loops and kind of nestle them in underneath the core sounds to add a little bit more character and uniqueness. This is a good area to start using these drum loop sounds to easily add your own spin on the sound that you've been referencing and take it into your own direction. So just quickly go through some of the sounds that I added in and the thought processing, a bit of the processing that I went through with these. The first one I added was this top loop here. Soloed, it sounds like this. So this is adding in a bunch of things. It's reinforcing the snare, it's reinforcing the hat, and there's a bit of extra hits in there, so it's adding some extra little groove and stuff like that. Something I like to do a lot with these top loops is if you set the warp to beats and it's on transient and you set it to the right arrow and dial this down, you can, similar to dialing down the sustain with that transient shaper, you're tightening up the sound a bit, and that helps it, I feel like, blend in with those core hits a lot more. In terms of any processing, a little bit of sidechain, so it's pumping, removing a bunch of the low ends, so it's keeping that nice and clear, having our main kick and that sub and the bass come through. A little bit of sidechain, like I mentioned. Again, even tightening it up a little bit more with the sustain here, and a little bit of that width, so we're pushing it to the left and right. Next element that I added was this top loop here. And then soloed. So you can hear here, that's mostly kind of snare. And so it's reinforcing the snare, and there's extra like snare hits, like ghost kind of snares, adding kind of like a shuffly, groovy kind of bit. In terms of nestling in, we're dialing back a lot of the transits, trying to tighten up that sound a whole bunch, removing some of the lows, dialing back the attack a bit so each hit isn't hitting as hard. Again, we're, like in this instance, we're trying to reinforce the core hits, not have them like fighting for that transient hit. Dialing back the sustain even more, a bit of sidechain, a little bit of one knob saturation, just Ableton saturator. And then last thing, these are actually freaking cool. There's these cool like different fills that happen. So I'm gonna pay attention right here, and then pay attention right here, and then pay attention right here, and then right here. Now. So really cool. I noticed there was like these cool drum fills in the reference track. First one is a little bit of a layer. So it's this like, let's listen to it. So one layer is like this weird little like distorted glitchy sound, and then it's reinforced with kind of like a tribal-y kind of sound. And then it's just two, so it's basically kind of a call and response. So first time there's a smaller fill, then there's a larger fill. Then there's a smaller fill, and then there's a slightly larger fill. So you can see like that's kind of that call and response changing over time idea. And then so there's just these cool fills I found. And then the larger one. So it sounds weird and kind of shitty actually on its own, but together I think it sounds really cool. Because it's playing against the core hits and all the other breaks and stuff like that. In terms of any processing on these things, removing a bunch of the lows, sidechain, width, on that like other layer, removing a bunch of the lows, a little bit of this like roar distortion, trying to make it sound less clean. It was the idea really. A little bit auto pan, so it's moving around left and right, and then the standard channel strip stuff. And then there's this little clav kind of sound I was hearing. Soloed all together. So that was something I was hearing in the reference as well. Just looked up. I think this one I could tell it was a clav, so I typed in clav in my library and then flicked around until I found something good. Replicated the pattern by flicking back and forth to the reference, and you're processing a little bit of lows, shelving out some of the highs to help it like nestle in a bit more, so it's not cutting through too much. And then there was this little tom thing that I kind of heard. And then I think the only kind of interesting thing here is I added the auto shift and had it so it's like submitting to the main, like I don't know why this happens. Like it changes the, like this is supposed to be an F sharp minor, I think, and it always like fucks around. But the idea here is to have it like it was a little bit tonal. There's like some kind of like melodic element to this tom, and I want it to like submit to the main scale so that it's sounding in key without having to do much like fussing around with like pitching. And then it's a little bit auto pan, really dialing in the EQ so it's removing lows and shelving out a bunch of the highs, so it's like nestling in the sound a bunch. Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good look at the overall loop. Something I do want to reinforce and like remind you is like as I was building up these loops, whether it was the drums or the vocals, it was usually like I had the vocal in like this. So that way, you know, kind of working in service of that hook again. You can see it's all really a lot of small, subtle sounds, making room for that hook to shine, which I think is pretty important here. So really, the key takeaway here is to overproduce the loop. Whether it's adding in extra elements like that you're getting creative with and adding in more things than you need, or you're like looking throughout the tune and trying to find other bits that come in for just certain parts, and add it to your main core loop. And the reason is, and then also I guess the other big thing is to mix as you go. So you notice like as I was doing it, I would add in a layer and then I'd automatically be removing some of the low end, just like by default, and then like adjusting some of the transient, a little bit of side chain, though, and then really focusing on getting the volume right. The kind of mix as you go aspect makes it a lot easier in the next couple steps here. So now, I think most producers think that turning that loop that we've just built here into a finished song can be the hardest part, right? I hear that like a lot, and really it can be the absolute opposite if we followed this process of main things at this point would be having the arrangement track here and having a reference track in here, then building out our loop and overproducing our loop. Because then the trick here is that we can use all these layers in our like fat and juicy loop that we built out here and use them as puzzle pieces. So I've said puzzle pieces a few times, and the main thing is because now what we can do is we can fill out the structure left to right by using all of these little individual elements, the drum sections, the melodic sections, the bass, those different vocal sections that we have, and use the reference and structure track that we've built here as kind of like a guide. And so what I'll usually do is I'll closely follow this reference track in my arrangement to keep things simple and fast. So a really simple thing that you can do is like grab everything, Control C, and then Control V it throughout the entire timeline. And then it's just an idea of subtracting the elements by listening to first, so you can like kind of follow like the intro, sub, break, all that. Like, okay, the break just removes the kick, those kinds of things. And then like listen to these sections one by one to adjust your layers, remove layers, or add layers. So it's more closely following this section here. And then once that kind of basic arrangement is, like, you can be able to get a nice like 30,000 foot view, bird's eye view of the overall track. So as you're making those smaller arrangement choices, working on transitions and all that, you know that like you don't want to maybe do anything too crazy here because the main drop is actually here. It makes you service the song a lot better, I would say. And then one of the things I'll do after working on these like macro changes, like working on the larger chunks, is then actually really as a way to like stop myself from going overboard with endless tweaks is I'll add a little transition tricks like low cuts, sweeps, lasers, and some master channel effects as a way to end the studio session for the day. And so what that really looks like is these little extra elements like this, little sweepers, crashes, reverse crashes. And really the trick I've been finding is it's fine to use these reverse sounds and swells and all this kind of stuff as long as you layer them in subtly. The idea is to like, if you're subtle with it, it's reinforcing everything and adding the vibe of like, I don't know, something rising, as opposed to it being like a main element somehow in the song. And that's when I think it gets cheesy and lame. And so then really that would be the end of that step there. And if you want to learn a little bit more about this arrangement process, definitely check out right here. Transitions and effects goes a bit more about how I do that effects grouping and the transitions and all that. But the main thing is then to take a little bit of a break. So that would end the third session. And then that way, when you come back to it, this like these little swoops and all these little crash and stuff, it feels like your song a lot more, gives it a sense of polish. And so when you do return after taking a break, you're less tempted to add in more layers. So I would say like definitely check out that video I mentioned. And if you want to get access to this project file, I think the best way would be to actually have a look at this in more detail on your own. And you can actually see the little tricks that happen because there's quite a bit of like automation that happens, filtering in sounds and all that kind of stuff. And really the best way would be for you to have a look at it here. So the idea is when you combine an overproduced loop with the reference track and structure track, like I was showing you, the song structuring like process can easily become the fastest and most effortless part of your whole music production process because you're just trying to treat everything as like puzzle pieces and using the reference and structure track as a guide. But now the big question is, how do you actually know that like your song is 100% done and ready for release at this point? And the truth is that this can be one of the hardest parts of all this, and it's because of the fact that that really is one of the hardest parts that I'm going to show you my simple 3-step solution for this. So I have this shown in the project file page here. And the first thing is one, the structure track. So you can slash your time by turning your loop into full song by using empty MIDI clips with song names and all that. Wait, sorry, no, that's the wrong thing. The first thing is this. This is how to confidently know your song is finished. It's the 3 things rule, which I think I'm going to call pick 3 because it reminds me of like some Call of Duty stuff. But the idea here is like take a break from the song, then listen to the song and pick the top 3 biggest changes that are going to have the biggest impact on the listener. And the idea really is the biggest impact on the listener. So say like your vocal is like off and not in this section and it really needs a vocal, then you should add a vocal in. Like a listener will notice that, right? As opposed to, okay, maybe the kick is slightly, not compressed or something. Like most people aren't going to actually notice that. So the idea is to really pick the 3 things that are going to have the biggest impact on the song. And when you return to your session, then like do those 3 things and then promise yourself to end the tweaking. The second thing is mixing and mastering. Usually there shouldn't be too much to mix at this point because we've been mixing as you go. But I will do some small touch-ups, so listening back and forth to the reference. Usually kind of grab like the section of the song that's the loudest, loop that, and like flick back and forth the reference and make some adjustments. And then also some small things I'll do on the bus group processing. I'm still kind of dialing in how I want to do this and explain this, but it's little things like adding in like a compressor to like slightly reduce the dynamic range, or adding in K-clip, so a clipper to shave off some of the transients at the top. Main thing is using these things lightly in a way to reduce the dynamic range in a small way here, so that when you're doing the final mastering, the limiters and everything on that stage of things don't need to work so hard, and you have a louder master a lot more effortlessly. And something I've been doing a lot lately as well is on the melodic group. What I'll do is I'll throw on this like track spacer and then have it side change to the vocal hook. So that way it's going to bring down some of the frequencies of the vocal only in sections where the vocal is playing over top of the melodic elements. And this way it just like slightly ducks the melodic stuff out of the way, only in those specific frequencies to make the vocal stand out a little bit more. So there's a small little trick there. And then the last thing is I'll run through this little mastering chain that I have here. It's pretty simple. It's just a compressor and then like mostly like a K-clip and then like a limiter, K-clip, limiter. It's staggering and stacking them so each one isn't working too hard. Definitely I'll make a video about that in a future time. I learned that from my buddy Zach Adam. And then trying to get the loudness to around negative decibels less for club mixing, so that way it sounds good for DJs, and then you can easily back off on that for like streaming releases. So I think just definitely a word of warning with some of this. Definitely this can be very hard if you try to just go with the flow and figure stuff out. So remember to use stuff like reference tracks and all that. And then also if you're trying to remember everything that like I'm telling you in this video, it might be a little bit overwhelming. You might skip some steps. And again, because that's so hard, I'm going to give access to these pages if I didn't mention. I make one of these pages for each one of these project files. So the video will be here, and like all these individual steps are kind of articulated nicely, and with additional videos where you might need them to go into more detail. You can check that out by heading over to the link in the description. That free Ultimate Song Finishing Toolkit will give you access to these. The only thing is if you actually want to you won't be able to download the project files unless you fully join the membership. If you want to join that and get access to over 30 pro project files based on Beatport Top 100 and top 10 tracks, over 30 of them, with a bunch of other extra tools and courses and stuff like that too. You can join the club by visiting bestfriendsclub.ca/join. The link is also in the description. And with that said, let's do a recap of the 80-20 rule next, so you can try to apply everything you've learned here into your next productions. Hi, my friend, Matt from Best Friends Club here. And if you've been paying attention to this super long video, then you've probably figured out what the 80-20 rule is when it comes to building out your songs. The goal here is to get 80% of the result with only 20% of the time, energy, and effort. And because the first key to the 80-20 rule here is to use a reference track, we're making sure that we're very easily hitting 80% of a high quality, professionally made song. In particular, we use that reference track to make sure that we're picking the right notes, sounds, and volumes as we're building out our song. The second key of the 80-20 rule here is to mix as you go in an extremely streamlined way by only focusing on the volume of each track, as well as using a simple repeatable channel strip for each track that we're adding to our songs. The third and final key is to repurpose your old project files and have a suite of powerful templates, Ableton racks, and one-knob effects that you've personalized and curated over time. If you'd like to get a head start by downloading all the racks, templates, and all the files that you've seen me use in the Ableton project file for this video, or if you'd just like to take a closer look at any of the techniques or tracks you saw me work on in this video at your own pace, you can find a link to this video's project files on screen now and at the second link that's in the YouTube description. I'm recreating a different song from the Beatport top charts every single week and making the project files available to anyone who wants them. You'll also get access to a private Discord where you can ask me and the community questions, as well as share tracks for feedback. If you or your music are not quite ready for a shot in the arm like that, I've also made you a completely free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that have helped me figure out how to completely finish one new song each and every single week. And you can grab that free Ultimate Song Finishing Toolkit by visiting the first link that's in the YouTube description here. However, if you just feel like staying on YouTube for now, that's totally fine. Save that link for later, and check out this playlist filled with videos just like the one you just watched, where I completely create songs inspired by tracks found in the Beatport top charts. Or if you really want to take what you've learned in this video to the next level, make sure you check out this video right here.